Samuel Washington knew the look. He'd seen it in the eyes of jittery suspects under interrogation lamps, in the faces of grieving mothers on rain-slicked asphalt, and in the sneers of men who thought a badge didn't change the color of the skin beneath it. It was a brittle, fractured look, the kind that came just before a person shattered. And he saw it now, clear as day, on the face of the woman wrestling with a stubborn carton of organic milk in the dairy aisle of the Harris Teeter. The air in the Charleston supermarket was heavy with the manufactured chill of aggressive air conditioning, a welcome but artificial respite from the thick, humid heat of a South Carolina July. It was the kind of heat that made the very air feel like a wet blanket, sticking to your skin and slowing your thoughts. Inside, the familiar hum of refrigeration units and the gentle squeak of cartwheels provided a mundane soundtrack to dozens of ordinary lives intersecting for a brief, forgettable moment. Or so it should have been. Sam, at 72, moved with a deliberate, steady grace that belied his age. His back was ramrod straight, a permanent fixture from decades of discipline, first in his youth and then for 30 years with the Charleston PD. He was here for a simple reason. His grandson Leo was coming for the weekend, and the boy had a bottomless appetite for the specific brand of honey oat cereal that was currently on sale. A small, pleasant mission. He navigated his cart through the aisles, his eyes scanning his surroundings not with suspicion, but with a deeply ingrained habit of observation. He noted the young mother trying to bribe her toddler with a cookie, the college kids debating the merits of different craft beers, the quiet rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon. Then he saw her, the woman with the fractured look. She was perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp business casual outfit that seemed ill-suited for the sweltering day. She was speaking into her phone, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "No, I told you, that's unacceptable, Mark. You fix it. You fix it now, or I swear I will." Her thumb jabbed the screen, ending the call with a vicious tap. She slammed the phone into her purse, her knuckles white. She grabbed the milk carton with such force that a little of it sloshed over the top. A string of frustrated curses escaped her lips, audible to anyone nearby. Sam gave her a wide berth, a lifetime of experience teaching him to steer clear of tempests and teacups. He turned his cart down the main aisle, heading towards the checkout. His mission was almost complete. That's when it happened. The woman, Karen Miller, shoved her own cart forward with blind frustration, her mind clearly 1,000 miles away, replaying her infuriating phone call. She rounded the corner of the snack aisle without looking, her cart ramming directly into the side of Sam's with a loud metallic clang. A box of Leo's cereal tumbled to the polished linoleum floor. It was a simple accident, a minor inconvenience. In a different moment, on a different day, it would have ended with a muttered, "Sorry," and a shared, fleeting moment of annoyance. But not today. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes, already blazing with anger from her phone call, finding a target. She didn't see a retired grandfather buying cereal. She saw an obstacle, a symbol of everything that was going wrong in her pressure cooker of a day. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, her voice sharp and frayed. Sam bent down slowly, his joints protesting mildly, and picked up the cereal box. He placed it back in his cart before looking at her. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. "My apologies, ma'am. I don't think you were looking." His calmness seemed to infuriate her more than any argument could have. It was like a placid lake reflecting her own ugly storm. "My apologies?" she mimicked, her voice rising in pitch, drawing the attention of a few nearby shoppers. "You people are always in the way, always expecting someone else to look out for you." The phrase hung in the air, ugly and sharp. "You people." Sam's posture, if possible, became even straighter. The warmth in his eyes receded, replaced by a familiar, weary stillness. He didn't respond. He simply held her gaze. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. A young man stocking potato chips a few feet away froze mid-motion, his eyes wide. Karen's face flushed, a mixture of anger and perhaps a dawning horror at what she was doing. But she had gone too far to back down. She doubled down. "What's the matter?" she spat, her voice trembling now. "Don't you have anything to say? Why don't you just go back to where you came from? Go back to Africa." The words landed like a physical blow. The quiet hum of the grocery store ceased. The toddler who had been whining was suddenly silent, his mother holding him tight. The college kids stared, their lighthearted debate forgotten. Every person within earshot turned to look. The aisle had become a stage, and a spotlight of horrified silence was now fixed on the two of them. Karen stood her ground, her chin held high in a gesture of defiance that didn't quite mask the tremor in her hands. She was clutching her cart handle like a shield. Sam did not raise his voice. He did not gesticulate. He did not move a single step closer. He simply let the silence ferment, letting her words echo in the ears of everyone present. Then, when the tension was so thick it felt like it could be sliced with a knife, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, almost gentle. "Let me tell you about where I'm from." He paused, letting the simple sentence land. "I'm from right here," he continued, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "My great-great-grandfather was brought to the docks less than 2 miles from this very store in chains. He and his family worked the rice fields of the Low Country, building the wealth of this state on their backs. So, you see, my family has been in Charleston a little longer than the Harris Teeter has." A nervous cough broke the silence from somewhere near the deli counter. Karen's defiant expression began to falter, her face paling. "My father," Sam went on, his eyes never leaving hers, "is buried in the National Cemetery just up the road. He fought in Korea. He came home to a country he'd bled for, a country that still made him use a separate entrance and drink from a different fountain. But he stayed. He believed in the promise of this place, even when it didn't believe in him." He took a slow, deliberate breath. The air crackled. "And me? I was born at St. Francis Hospital downtown. I grew up on these streets. And for 30 years, I wore the blue uniform of the Charleston Police Department. 30 years, ma'am." He let that sink in. "I've responded to robberies, delivered babies in the back of my patrol car, and I've knocked on doors to tell mothers that their sons weren't coming home. I spent 3 decades of my life patrolling these very streets, keeping people just like you safe." The finality of his words was absolute. He hadn't just defended himself. He had laid bare the staggering depth of her ignorance. He had held up a mirror, and the reflection was unbearable. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. The carefully constructed walls of her anger and frustration crumbled, leaving only raw, gaping shame. Her eyes darted around, seeking an ally, a friendly face, but found only a sea of stunned, judgmental, and, in some cases, pitying expressions. Then, a sound. It started with a single person, the young man who had been stocking chips. He slowly, deliberately, put his hands together. Clap. The sound was stark in the silence. Then an older woman near the produce section joined in. Clap, clap. Soon it was a ripple, then a wave, a quiet, rolling applause that wasn't celebratory, but affirmative. It was a sound of respect, a sound of consensus. Karen stumbled back, her face ashen. She wrenched her cart around and fled, pushing it blindly toward the exit, leaving her half-full basket of groceries behind. Sam stood for a moment longer, the applause washing over him. He felt no victory, only a profound and ancient weariness. He looked down the aisle and saw what he had instinctively known was there. A teenager, no older than 16, was lowering his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. The lens had been pointed directly at them the entire time. The storm had passed. But Sam Washington knew the hurricane was just now making landfall. The internet moves at the speed of outrage. By the time Sam Washington had paid for his grandson's cereal and driven the 10 minutes back to his quiet, oak-lined street, the video was already mutating. It had a name number, Charleston Karen, and it was multiplying across platforms like a virus, each share, each comment, each angry emoji adding to its momentum. Sam's home was his sanctuary. It was a small, neat bungalow with a wide front porch and azalea bushes that were his late wife, Eleanor's, pride and joy. He'd lived there for 40 years. It was where he'd raised his daughter, where he'd nursed Eleanor through her final illness, and where he now enjoyed the quiet solitude of retirement. As he put the groceries away, the silence of the house felt different, less like peace, and more like the calm before a storm he hadn't asked for. He didn't own a smartphone, capable of navigating the treacherous waters of social media, but his landline began to ring around 6 p.m. It was his daughter, Maria. Her voice tight, with a familiar mix of love and exasperation. "Dad? Are you okay? Leo just showed me a video." Sam sighed, sinking into his favorite armchair, the worn leather groaning in protest. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just another Tuesday." "It's not just another Tuesday, Dad. It's everywhere. People are calling you a hero." A hero. The word felt hollow. He hadn't felt heroic. He'd felt tired. He had spent a lifetime building a dam of dignity against a relentless tide of slights, both big and small. The encounter at the Harris Teeter was just another crack in that dam, and his response was simply him plugging the leak, just as he'd always done. The fact that someone had filmed it didn't change the weariness that settled in his bones afterward. It reminded him of his father, returning from Korea, a decorated soldier who still had to prove his worth every single day on the streets of his own hometown. The uniform changed, but the fight remained the same. Meanwhile, across town in a sleek, glass-walled apartment overlooking the Cooper River, Karen Miller's world was imploding. The video, stripped of context and nuance, had become her digital effigy. Her phone was a relentless torrent of hate. Notifications flashed with such speed that the messages blurred into a single, cohesive scream of condemnation. Her personal information, her address, her place of work, her ex-husband's name had been unearthed and flung into the public square by digital vigilantes. She sat on her pristine white sofa, staring at the screen, her body trembling. A notification from her company's HR department popped up. Mandatory administrative leave, pending investigation. A text from her fiancé, Mark, the man she'd been arguing with on the phone hours earlier. "We need to talk. I'm staying at my brother's tonight." She tried to form a defense in her mind. "I was having a bad day. The pressure is immense. He bumped into me. I didn't mean it like that." But the excuses withered under the harsh glare of her own recorded voice. The venom she heard was undeniable. It was a part of her she hadn't known existed, or perhaps had refused to acknowledge. The worst part was the shame, a deep, burning shame that felt like swallowing hot coals. Where had that ugliness come from? It felt alien, yet it had come from her own mouth. At the downtown offices of the Post and Courier, Sarah Jenkins was scrolling through the same feeds. At 25, she was hungry and ambitious, eager to move beyond puff pieces and local festival coverage. The number Charleston Karen story had landed on her desk as a quick, low-effort piece on viral trends. Just a few paragraphs, her editor had said. Easy clickbait. But as Sarah watched the video for the 10th time, she felt a professional unease. It was too neat, too clean. The villain was cartoonishly evil, the hero stoic and noble. Real life was rarely so black and white. She focused on the man, Samuel Washington. There was a profound sadness in his eyes that the cheering crowds in the comment sections seemed to miss. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was enduring a trial. Her journalistic instincts took over. This wasn't just a story about a racist outburst. It was a story about two people, and she only had one side. Clicks were one thing. The truth was another. She started digging. A simple background check on Samuel Washington yielded the expected results. A long, decorated career with the Charleston PD, retired with honors. But Sarah went deeper, pulling up archived articles, commendations, and public records. She found a piece from the early 90s about his involvement in a community outreach program, another about a commendation for bravery during a hostage situation. Then, a small human interest story from 10 years ago about his father, a veteran of the 77th Engineer Combat Company, one of the segregated units that served in Korea. The article quoted Sam. "My father taught me that service isn't about getting thanks. It's about doing what's right, especially when no one is looking." The quote resonated with what she'd seen in the video. This man wasn't a stranger to prejudice or a stranger to service. Her editor buzzed her on the internal line. "You got that Karen piece ready, Jenkins? It's dying down." Almost, Sarah lied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm just confirming a few details about the man in the video." She knew she was onto something more significant. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface of the viral storm. The story wasn't about the 2 minutes of video everyone was watching. It was about the decades of life that had led both Samuel Washington and Karen Miller to that specific aisle, at that specific moment. And she was determined to find out what that was. Sarah Jenkins worked best when she had a thread to pull. The number Charleston Karen story was a tangled knot, but the thread she'd found was Samuel Washington. His file was a testament to a life of quiet, relentless duty. She spent the next morning scrolling through microfiche, the dusty, analog smell of old newsprint filling her small cubicle. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just a sense of the man beyond the viral clip. She found commendations for de-escalating domestic disputes, photos of him at community baseball games, and a brief mention of his wife Eleanor's passing 5 years prior. A picture of a life lived, not just a career served. Satisfied she had a clear picture of Sam, she turned her attention to the other side of the equation, Karen Miller. The internet had already done the ugly work of doxing her, But Sarah bypassed the vitriolic forums and went straight to public records databases. She knew Karen's current name, age, and address. It was the name she didn't have that mattered. A quick search of marriage licenses provided it. Before she was Karen Miller, she was Karen Adler. It was a common enough name. Sarah plugged Karen Adler and Charleston into the newspaper's digital archives, expecting to find a high school graduation announcement or a college dean's list mention. Instead, the screen populated with a headline that made the air in her lungs go cold. Local businessman killed in home invasion. Daughter survives. The date was the 12th of October, 20 years ago. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She clicked the link, her mouse hovering with a sense of dread. The article was brief, a brutal summary of a life cut short. Robert Adler, a successful restaurateur, had been found dead in his home in the affluent South of Broad neighborhood. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The sole witness was his 18-year-old daughter, Karen, who had hidden in a closet during the attack. The perpetrators had ransacked the house, and the crime was being investigated as a robbery gone wrong. This couldn't be a coincidence. The city wasn't that big, the name not that common. The fractured, angry woman in the supermarket video was the same girl who had survived that unimaginable horror. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. The narrative had just shifted beneath her feet, the ground cracking open to reveal something dark and deep. This wasn't just about a moment of prejudice, it was about a lifetime of trauma. Her next step was risky. Accessing old police reports was not easy for a junior reporter. But she had a source, a grizzled, nearing retirement desk sergeant named Fitz, who had a soft spot for her and a healthy disdain for modern, click-driven journalism. She called him, framing her request carefully. "Fitz, it's Sarah Jenkins. I'm working on a deep dive piece about cold cases. Just doing some background. Do you have anything on a home invasion homicide from 2 decades back?" Victim was Robert Adler. She could hear him sigh on the other end of the line, the sound of a man who'd rather be fishing. Adler. "Yeah, I remember that one. Nasty business. Never fully solved. Why are you digging that up?" "Just following a lead," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Could you just tell me who the lead detective was on the case? The first officer on scene?" There was a pause, the sound of slow, deliberate typing. "Let's see. Adler, Robert, patrol response. Initial officer. Huh. You're not going to believe this, kid." Sarah held her breath. "First responding officer on scene," Fitz read, his voice flat with mild surprise. "Detective Samuel Washington." The thread she had been pulling on had just led her to the heart of the labyrinth. The connection wasn't tangential. It was direct, brutal, and forged in blood. The man Karen Miller had told to go back to Africa was the very same man who had stepped into the worst night of her life. He was the one who had walked into the aftermath of her father's murder. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the world tilting slightly on its axis. She stared at her monitor, where 2 browser tabs were open side by side. One held the viral video of a public shaming, a spectacle of modern rage. The other held the ghost of a 20-year-old tragedy. The 2 stories were, 1. She now understood the look in Samuel Washington's eyes. It wasn't just the weariness of a man facing prejudice. It was the weariness of a man who knew secrets, who carried the weight of other people's darkest moments. And she now understood with a sickening certainty that Karen Miller's outburst wasn't a simple act of racism. It was a symptom of a wound that had never healed, a scream of pain that had been festering for 20 years, aimed, by a cruel twist of fate, at the one person who had been there when the wound was first inflicted. This was no longer a story about a viral video. It was a story about memory, trauma, and the devastating power of a forgotten past. And Sarah Jenkins was standing right in the middle of it. For Karen Miller, the days following the incident were a descent into a surreal hell. Her immaculate apartment, once a sanctuary of minimalist order, now felt like a prison. The constant, hateful glow of her phone screen was a torment she couldn't bring herself to turn off. It was a form of self-flagellation, a need to see the full scope of her public destruction. Her dismissal from work had been swift and sterile, a 2-sentence email from HR. Mark, her fiancé, had texted once more. "I think it's best we take a break." My family saw the video. Every severed tie was another bar on her cage. But underneath the searing humiliation, something else was stirring. The digital onslaught was a relentless, high-pitched scream that, paradoxically, began to shake loose older, deeper silences within her. The pressure was cracking open faults in her memory that had been sealed for 20 years. Fragments of that night began to surface, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. The splintering sound of the back door giving way. The smell of her father's cigar smoke, still lingering in the den. The muffled, terrified sound of her own breathing inside the narrow linen closet, her knees pressed against her chest. And then, a new memory, one that had always been hazy, began to sharpen. After the terrible sounds had stopped, after a silence that felt like an eternity, there were new sounds. Heavy footsteps. A calm, deep voice calling out, "Charleston PD, is anyone here?" She remembered a sliver of light as the closet door was pulled open. A large silhouette blocked the hallway light. A man's face, looking down at her. He was a police officer. He was black. The memory was tangled with the raw, primal terror of the moment. For 20 years, her traumatized mind had compressed the timeline. The arrival of the police had become intertwined with the failure to prevent the horror. In her fragmented recollection, they were part of the same terrible event, their presence a symbol of their lateness. They didn't save him. That feeling had calcified into a quiet, resentful belief. It had become a dark, unexamined corner of her mind, a place where grief and fear had curdled into a vague, misdirected prejudice she never acknowledged, even to herself, until it had erupted in the dairy aisle of the Harris Teeter. Now, facing the man's image on her laptop screen, the stoic, dignified man from the supermarket, her mind struggled to reconcile the two figures. Was he the same one? The man she had screamed at? Was he the one who had opened that closet door? The thought was so monstrous, so grotesquely ironic, that her mind recoiled from it. It was too much to bear. Across town, Sam Washington had finally agreed to a single brief interview. His daughter, Maria, had convinced him. "You have to, Dad," she'd urged. "Right now you're a symbol. You need to be a person again. Let them hear your voice, not just see your face in that awful video. Then it will be over." He consented, not for the fame, but for the hope of an ending. He wanted to reclaim the quiet rhythm of his life. He agreed to speak with a young reporter from the Post and Courier, Sarah Jenkins, who had called and spoken to him with a respect and gravity that felt different from the clamor of the other media requests. He prepared for her arrival with the meticulous habit of an old cop. He tidied the living room, dusted the mantelpiece, and made a fresh pot of coffee. His eyes lingered on the photographs arrayed on the mantel. There was one of his wedding day, Eleanor radiant in white, one of Maria in her cap and gown, and tucked in the back, a framed photo of his old precinct team, taken sometime in the late 90s. A group of men, black and white, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, all of them younger and less weary than they would become. His gaze fell on one face, in particular his old partner, a detective named Danny Riley. A good cop, a good man, lost to a heart attack far too young. Sam's mind drifted back to the chaotic years, the long nights, the cases that stuck with you, the ones that became ghosts in the filing cabinet of your memory. The Adler case was one of those ghosts. He hadn't thought about it in years, but the media storm had dredged up old sediment. He remembered the smell of the house, the look on the young girl's face, the raw, animal fear. He straightened the photo of his team, a sudden, profound sadness washing over him. He had spent his life trying to bring order to chaos, to stand as a thin blue line against the darkness. But sometimes, the darkness just seeped through the cracks. Sometimes, you were just a witness to the aftermath. The doorbell rang, pulling him back to the present. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. It was time to face the cameras, to say his piece, and hopefully, to finally put this all to rest. He had no idea that the young woman on his doorstep was about to pull the pin on a grenade he didn't even know he was holding. Sarah Jenkins sat on the edge of Sam Washington's floral sofa, her notepad feeling flimsy and inadequate in her hands. The living room was exactly as she'd imagined, clean, orderly, and filled with the quiet dignity of a life well lived. Sam sat opposite her in his worn leather armchair, a mug of black coffee held in his steady hands. He projected an aura of calm, but Sarah, a student of human nature, could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "Thank you again for agreeing to speak with me, Mr. Washington," she began, her voice respectful. "I know this can't be easy." "It's Sam," he corrected her gently. "And it's necessary, I suppose. My daughter insists." He offered a faint, weary smile. The interview started predictably. Sarah asked him about the incident at the supermarket, about how he felt. Sam's answers were concise and measured. He spoke not of anger, but of a deep-seated disappointment. He talked about his father's service, about his own years on the force, framing the event not as a personal attack, but as a symptom of a larger, ongoing struggle. He was doing exactly what Maria had hoped, transforming himself from a symbol back into a man. Sarah let him speak, filling pages with his thoughtful, eloquent words. This was the story her editor wanted. This was the story the public expected. But it wasn't the whole story. Her heart pounded as she prepared to step off the safe path. "Sam," she said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. "In preparing for this interview, I looked into your career with the Charleston PD. It was exemplary. So many commendations." He gave a slight, self-deprecating shrug. "We all just did our job. One case stood out to me." Sarah pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "A difficult one, from about 20 years ago. A home invasion on Trad Street, the Adler family. The change in him was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't a flinch or a startle, but a sudden, deep stillness, as if a switch had been flipped deep inside him. The air in the room grew colder, heavier. The weary calm in his eyes was replaced by something else, a shadow that seemed to rise from a great depth. "That's an old file, Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice losing its warmth, becoming flat and professional. The voice of a cop at a crime scene. "I know," she said softly. "I also know that the young woman who survived, her name was Karen Adler." Sam placed his coffee mug on the coaster beside his chair with meticulous care. He did not look at her. He stared at the mantelpiece, at the ghosts in the picture frames. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rasp, thick with a history she could only guess at. "That was one of the worst nights of my career," he said, the words costing him something. "A night you don't forget, no matter how hard you try." He fell silent, clearly signaling the topic was closed. But Sarah couldn't stop. She was too close. The case was never fully solved, was it? The report said there were 2 assailants, but only one was ever vaguely identified from a neighbor's description. Sam turned his head slowly and looked at her. His eyes were dark pools of memory. "There's a lot that wasn't in the reports." And then, he said something that wasn't in any file, something that changed everything. "I made a mistake that night," he confessed, the words quiet but heavy as lead. "A rookie mistake from a veteran cop. In the chaos, I lost a piece of evidence." Sarah's pen froze over her notepad. "It was a Zippo lighter," Sam continued, his voice barely a whisper, speaking more to the ghosts in the room than to her. "Silver, with a bald eagle engraved on it. It wasn't the victim's. I saw one of them drop it near the den as he fled. I picked it up. My focus was on the girl, on getting her out of there, on securing the scene. Somewhere between the house and the patrol car, it was gone. Vanished." He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. "I searched for it for hours afterward, turned my own car inside out, but it was gone. It was our best chance at an ID. A print, DNA, anything. Without it, the trail on the second man went cold. That case, it was a failure. My failure." Sarah stared at him, utterly stunned. This wasn't just a tragic memory for him. It was a source of deep, personal shame. The hero of the viral video carried the weight of a secret failure, a ghost that had haunted his otherwise stellar career. The missing Zippo lighter was the key to a 20-year-old mystery, a mystery that connected Sam Washington and Karen Miller in a way neither of them could possibly comprehend. She had come here looking for the story behind the video. She had found the story behind a murder. And she realized with a sudden, sickening jolt that she was now the only person in the world who held both pieces of the puzzle. Sarah Jenkins drove away from Sam Washington's bungalow in a daze, the quiet suburban streets seeming alien and surreal. The weight of his confession sat like a stone in her stomach. The story was no longer about a public shaming. It was about a private grief, a shared trauma, and a decades-old injustice. Her role had shifted from reporter to reluctant keeper of secrets. To publish Sam's admission about the lost evidence would be a career-making scoop, but it would also be a cruel betrayal of a man who had trusted her with his deepest professional regret. But to do nothing felt like a different kind of failure. Karen Miller was being crucified online, her life systematically dismantled for an act born not of pure malice, but of a profound, misremembered trauma. She deserved to know the truth. The irony was devastating. The man she saw as the embodiment of her prejudice was, in fact, the first guardian she'd had in the aftermath of her life's defining tragedy. Sarah knew what she had to do. This was no longer a story to be written, at least not yet. It was a connection to be made. Finding Karen wasn't hard. The internet had already done that work. After 2 days of unanswered calls and emails, Sarah decided on a direct approach. She drove to the sleek, modern apartment building overlooking the river. She didn't bring a notepad or a recorder. She came armed only with the truth. She found Karen walking out of the lobby, bundled in a hoodie and sunglasses, despite the oppressive heat, clearly trying to be invisible. She looked pale and diminished, a ghost haunting her own life. "Karen?" Sarah said, her voice gentle. Karen flinched, her body tensing, as if expecting another verbal assault. "What do you want? To get a picture? To ask me how it feels to be the most hated woman in America?" Her voice was brittle, stripped of its earlier venom and left with only raw, defensive pain. "No," Sarah said, holding up her hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not here for that. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a reporter. But I'm not here to ask you questions. I'm here to tell you something. Something I think you need to know." Karen eyed her with deep suspicion. "I'm not interested." "It's about the man from the supermarket," Sarah pressed, keeping her voice low. "It's about Samuel Washington." At the mention of his name, Karen's defensive posture hardened. "I have nothing to say about him." "You don't have to say anything," Sarah said. "You just have to listen. Please, 5 minutes. There's a coffee shop around the corner that's always empty this time of day." Something in Sarah's earnest, non-judgmental tone must have broken through Karen's defenses. Or perhaps it was just the exhaustion of being constantly on guard. With a sigh of weary resignation, Karen gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. They sat in a sterile, silent coffee shop, a chasm of unspoken history between them. Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The things you said to him were wrong, Karen," she began, her voice firm but not accusatory. "But I don't think you know who you were talking to." Karen stared down at her hands, which were trembling slightly on the table. "I interviewed him," Sarah continued, "and I did some research on his career. He was a police officer for 30 years. She paused, letting the first piece of information settle. Then she delivered the second. 20 years ago, he was a detective. On the 12th of October, he was the first officer to respond to a 911 call from a house in the South of Broad neighborhood. Karen's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide and filled with a dawning, horrified confusion, locked onto Sarah's. The blood drained from her face. "The call was about a home invasion," Sarah said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "At the home of Robert Adler." The world stopped. Karen's breath hitched, a small, choked sound in the quiet cafe. The name of the man from the supermarket, Samuel Washington, collided in her mind with the hazy, terrifying memory of the police officer who had opened the closet door. The two figures, one a target of her inexplicable rage, the other a forgotten feature of her deepest trauma, merged into one. It wasn't possible. It was a cosmic, cruel joke. The man she had vilified, the man she had told to leave a country he had served his entire life, was the same man who had shielded her from the horror in that hallway. He was the one who had gently led her away from her father's body. The fragments of memory, the shame, the confusion, and 2 decades of buried grief erupted at once. A single ragged sob escaped her lips. It wasn't a cry of anger or self-pity. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. She covered her face with her hands as 20 years of pain came pouring out, right there in the sterile silence of an empty coffee shop. The past is not a foreign country. It is a landscape we carry within us, its topography shaped by memory and pain. For Karen, that landscape had been a fog-shrouded wasteland for 20 years. Now, the fog was beginning to burn away, and the truth of that night was emerging in stark, agonizing detail. The chapter of her life that had been written in the third person by trauma was now being relived in the first. Oktober 12, 20 years ago, Karen's perspective. The world was the rough texture of the linen sheets against her cheek, and the frantic, shallow gasps of her own breath in the suffocating dark of the closet. The sounds from downstairs had stopped, the awful, wet, percussive sounds. Then the heavy footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. Not her father's footsteps. Her heart, already a frantic drum, tried to beat its way out of her chest. This is it. This is how it ends. The footsteps stopped outside the closet door. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for an invisibility she didn't possess. The handle turned. Light flooded in, blinding her. She flinched, throwing an arm over her face. A massive figure stood silhouetted against the bright hallway light. "It's okay," a deep voice said. Calm, not threatening. "It's the police. My name is Detective Washington. Are you hurt?" She couldn't speak. She could only shake. A leaf in a hurricane. He knelt down, bringing his face level with hers. He was black, his features etched with a concern that was so profound it momentarily pierced through her terror. "We're going to get you out of here," he said softly. He didn't reach for her, didn't rush her. He just waited. "Can you stand?" As he helped her out of the closet, his body deliberately shielded her from the view down the hallway, towards the master bedroom where the sounds had been. He put a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder and steered her in the opposite direction, towards the stairs. "Don't look back," he commanded, his voice a low rumble of authority and compassion. "Just look at me. Keep your eyes on me." And she did. She looked at the blue of his uniform, the glint of his badge, the deep, steady brown of his eyes, and she walked. It was the only thing in this spinning, nightmarish world that felt solid. October 12, 20 years ago. Sam's perspective. The call had come in as a B, E in progress. But the silence on the line after the initial scream told a different story. Sam was the first through the door, his service weapon drawn, his partner Danny Riley right behind him. The house was a wreck, drawers pulled out, paintings askew. It smelled of fear. He found Robert Adler in the den. It was a scene he would spend years trying to forget. He did a quick, professional sweep. No one else on the main floor. "Upstairs, Danny," he'd said, his voice tight. He took the stairs, 2 at a time. The second assailant was a ghost. A back window was shattered, the likely exit point. Then he heard a tiny, whimpering sound from a linen closet. He holstered his weapon, his training kicking in. A victim, likely a child. He opened the door and found the teenage girl, Karen, folded into herself like a piece of origami. The terror radiating from her was a physical force. His first thought wasn't about the case or the perpetrators. It was about protecting this child from any more horror. As he guided her down the stairs, his entire focus was on her, a human shield against the trauma that lay behind them. It was in that moment of intense focus, his senses devoted to the trembling girl at his side, that it must have happened. The Zippo lighter, the one he had instinctively scooped up from the den floor and slipped into his jacket pocket, must have fallen. He wouldn't realize it was gone until an hour later, sitting in his patrol car, the adrenaline finally starting to recede. The guilt had been immediate and corrosive. He had prioritized the victim's emotional state over a crucial piece of evidence. It was the right human choice, but in the cold, hard calculus of police work, it was a catastrophic professional error. The ghost of that second man, and the silver lighter that might have identified him, would become a permanent resident in the back of his mind. Present day. In her silent, darkened apartment, Karen finally lowered her hands from her face. The tears had stopped. In their place was a hollow, echoing clarity. The truth was far worse than the hazy narrative she had constructed. She hadn't just been wrong. She had been monstrously, cosmically wrong. Her rage, her prejudice, her public humiliation, it was all a grotesque epilogue to a story whose first chapter she had completely misunderstood. She hadn't hated a stranger. She had desecrated the memory of a guardian. The weight of that realization was crushing, leaving no room for anger or self-pity, only a profound and bottomless shame. She now knew she couldn't hide. She couldn't run. A simple apology was a pathetic, inadequate gesture for a wound this deep. She had to face him. She had to stand before the man who had witnessed the beginning of her pain, and somehow, impossibly, ask for forgiveness for causing him new pain at the end of his life. Shame is a powerful catalyst. For days, it had paralyzed Karen, trapping her in a cycle of regret and isolation. But now, illuminated by the harsh light of memory, it transformed into a different kind of energy, a desperate, urgent need for atonement. An apology posted online or a statement released through a lawyer would be a coward's act. It wouldn't mend the wound she had inflicted. It would just be a sterile bandage placed over a festering infection. She had to face him. She had to look Samuel Washington in the eye and own the full, horrifying scope of her actions. Summoning a courage she didn't know she possessed, she called the only person who could possibly help her. "Sarah?" Karen's voice was hoarse, stripped of all its former confidence. "It's Karen Miller. I need to ask you for something. Something impossible." Sarah, who had been anxiously waiting for this call, listened patiently. "I need to see him," Karen said, the words barely a whisper. "I need to talk to him. Not for an interview, not for a story. Just me and him. Can you ask him?" "I know I have no right, but I have to." Sarah felt a profound sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was no longer just a reporter. She was a conduit, the single bridge between two lives shattered and remade by the same tragedy. "I'll ask, Karen," she promised. "I can't guarantee anything, but I'll ask." When Sarah arrived at Sam's bungalow for the second time, the atmosphere was different. He knew why she was there before she even spoke. He listened without interruption as she relayed Karen's request, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. "She remembers, Sam." Sarah finished softly. "She remembers you were there. She remembers you helped her." Sam was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the quiet street outside his window. He wasn't angry. The anger had burned out long ago, leaving only a deep, residual sorrow. He saw not the snarling woman from the supermarket, but the ghost of a terrified 18-year-old girl, her eyes wide with a horror no one should ever have to witness. He saw a life derailed by a violence he had been powerless to prevent. "Tell her yes," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Tell her to meet me at the park, at the Battery, by the water, tomorrow at sunset." But the conversation had stirred something else in Sam, a dormant instinct from his 30 years on the force. The ghost of the Adler case, long buried, was now wide awake. The missing Zippo. His confession to Sarah had felt like a final admission of failure, but now, a different feeling was taking root. A stubborn, flickering ember of unfinished business. Before Sarah left, he made a decision. That afternoon, he drove to the precinct, not as a civilian, but as a retired detective calling in a favor. He found his old friend, Sergeant Fitz, drowning in a sea of paperwork. "Fitz," Sam said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to do something for me, off the books." Fitz leaned back, intrigued, the famous Sam Washington. "What can I do for you, celebrity?" "Cut it out," Sam said, though a faint smile touched his lips. "I need you to look at the evidence log for an old case. Homicide. Adler, Robert. 20 years ago." Fitz raised an eyebrow. "That case again?" The reporter was just asking about it. "I know," Sam said. "I think I screwed something up back then. I think a piece of evidence went missing. A silver Zippo lighter." "A Zippo," Fitz mused. "I'll have a look in the cold case archives. But Sam, after 20 years, things get misplaced. Don't get your hopes up. Just look," Sam insisted. "Please." He had a feeling, a cop's hunch that had lain dormant for years. A sense that a thread was loose, and if he just pulled it, something might unravel. The next evening, Sam stood at the edge of the Battery, the park that bordered Charleston's historic harbor. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, casting a golden light on the cannons that pointed silently out toward Fort Sumter. The air was warm, smelling of salt and pluff mud. It was a place of beauty, but also of history, of sieges and defenses. It felt appropriate. He saw her approaching, a solitary figure walking along the seawall. She was no longer the sharp-edged, aggressive woman from the supermarket, nor the terrified girl from the hallway. She looked like a ship that had been battered by a storm, her sails torn, drifting towards an uncertain shore. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the weight of 2 decades of silence, grief, and misunderstanding. The confrontation was about to begin.